This is In the Classroom, an educational podcast making teaching and learning more transparent. Today I want to provide an overview of the latest changes to the publication manual of the American Psychological Association. This is specifically related to learners who are currently taking courses in the BA program in English language teaching, and I wanted to not only touch on some of the latest changes, but also some of the general points about academic writing that we typically discuss with learners throughout the BA at all levels, from Prope all the way to 8th semester. If you have any feedback or additional ideas or perspective about writing using APA, feel free to reach out to me at my Twitter handle, BNLEEZ. Also, everything that I discuss here, I will provide links to in my website at benjaminlstewart.org. So if you want to look at the SWAY presentation, much of what I talk about today, if you're listening to this podcast, I think can be assisted. If you want to refer to the SWAY, feel free to find the post located at my website. If you want to see the SWAY version and see the various slides and examples that I talk about today. All right, so let's get into it here. I am going to begin here with the SWAY presentation. This is the publication manual, the 7th edition, and this is what I'll be referring to throughout today's discussion. Okay, in the SWAY presentation, you can have access to this video if you want to take a look and refer to it. Just provides a general overview of the publication manual. But this is, again, a tutorial. It's meant to provide some main points of academic writing. We want to make sure we distinguish between other forms of writing that learners may be asked to do throughout the BA. What we discussed today really does not relate to reflective writing. Many practicum classes, for example, will require students to write out reflections. It's always best to check directly with the instructor to make sure that if he or she needs some sort of reference and you're obligated to use APA, that you are clear if you need to do that. So again, make sure you're checking with your instructor to find out the details if you need to bring in outside sources to your writing. But most of what we discussed today are going to be things that relate to academic text. If you're going to write a 5-paragraph essay, for example, or if you're going to write a more substantive text like a literature review in 7th semester academic writing or thesis seminar, then certainly this will be the what you need to adhere to whenever you're citing outside sources. Again, the goal here is to provide a very concise reference to students. I'm going to try to keep this on point and relatively brief, but there are many details, many things that I talk about here are only going to scratch the surface. You're always encouraged to seek out some of the details here that I'm going to bring up today if you need further clarification. Okay, so Chapter 1, Scholarly Writing and Publishing Principles. So for those of you who are taking thesis seminar, and probably as you're developing your literature review in 7th semester, it's good to think about ethical compliance. So when you go about collecting data and you're going out to different schools, for example, collecting data from students or schools, that you are being very careful to get the proper consent forms, the informed consent forms that are going to be required so that they have or you have permission to collect the data and actually report and investigate. It's very important that these informed consent forms are agreed upon not only by the participants themselves, but maybe in some cases the actual schools. So it's always best to get permission from the school, whether in writing or at least verbal, that you have authorization to collect the data. Anytime you have students that are younger, if they're children, then you also may need the consent from the parents. So again, I would always start with the school first, begin there, and then make sure that you're reaching out to the proper educational stakeholders and getting proper permissions in order to collect the data and then report on it later. You may or may not need an institutional review, but always make sure you're working very closely with your tutor to again, assure that proper permissions are being collected. Again, this primarily is only going to be relevant to those taking thesis seminar or any other research-based situations where you're collecting the data and then you're going to report publicly the findings You want to make sure that you get the permissions. Now, Chapter 2, Paper Elements and Format. The 7th edition of the Publication Manual of the American Psychological Association provides it provides a detailed example of a kind of a student title page that would be more applicable to learners to distinguish that from maybe a formal publication type of situation. What I've done here is I've included a link in this way to a Word document that students can access, and I think it's a good starting point to begin any type of academic text. It begins with a title page where it has information about our university, and then followed by the title of the paper, the name of the student, the name of the course and semester, the instructor, and the date. And then below that, you'll have on the title page the author note, which you might include the genre, the audience, and the purpose. This may or may not be necessary. Again, check with your instructor to see what kind of information he or she is going to be looking for writing the paper. But know that this particular document has been shared with teachers in the academy, so there is some familiarity with this document, and you can again use this for basis of beginning your work. Now, in the first page here, there is information that relates to the introduction paragraph and also different organizational patterns that you might find useful to reflect on when you're thinking about how you want to organize your ideas for your academic text. So again, take a look at this Word document. This is going to be available. Again, you can access the link via the Sway. And again, it's always best to check with the instructor to make sure that you're meeting the requirements for the particular assignment. Now, the order of pages, there's a list of recommended sections and the order in which you should present this. This is a detailed list that is going to apply, again, more for those who are taking thesis seminar. It states here you want to begin with the title page, followed by an abstract, which is going to be on a separate page. And then a new page will begin the text. And then at the end, the references will be on a separate page. If you have footnotes, that'll be on a separate page, but I doubt you'll be needing to include footnotes for any assignments. And then if you have any visuals like tables or figures, you're going to include those on separate pages. And afterwards, if you have appendices, you'll include a separate page for each appendix. So if you have 3 appendices, you'll have 3 separate pages, one for each appendix. Now, if you're just writing a 5-paragraph essay, then you're probably only going to have a title page. You'll have the text itself and then a separate page for references at the end. You probably will not need an abstract. In most cases, the only reason you would include an abstract, I think, would be for a literature review in academic writing, and obviously your thesis paper for 8th semester thesis seminar, you'll include an abstract. But probably you won't need to include an abstract unless the writing assignment in and of itself is just the learning of how to develop an abstract. Again, check with your instructor to follow his or her requirements. Now, one of the changes that I think is significant in the latest edition of the publication manual is the flexibility of fonts now that are acceptable. Before, Times New Roman font size 12 was really the only font listed. Now there are some additional fonts that are available. I think by default, if you open up Word for the first time, it's going to default to Calibri, 11-point Calibri. Make sure that you're following the size of the font as listed here. So if you're going to use Calibri, make sure it's 11-point, not 10 nor 12. Make sure that it's as listed here. Times New Roman's listed. Arial now is listed. So again, these are the acceptable fonts. You have a little bit of flexibility now in which fonts that you may use. Headings for those who are taking thesis seminar and academic writing, who are developing a more substantive literature review, you may require 3-level headings. If you're writing a 5-paragraph essay, basically you're only going to need a 1-level heading, and you're going to include the title of the paper at the top, And you'll include another level 1 heading called references, where you'll list, obviously, your references at the end. But if you're going to write a literature review, you may need 2, maybe 3 level headings. And the change here for the 7th edition of the publication manual really applies to the 3rd level. So let's take each one in turn. The level 1 heading should be centered to the page, in bold, titled case heading, that is, main words are capitalized, and it's going to be on its own line. The text will begin a new paragraph just below. Now, level 2 heading will be flush left, in bold, title case heading, that is, main words are capitalized, and again, the text will begin a new paragraph. It'll appear below. So there are no changes to the level 1 or level 2 heading between the 6th and 7th edition of the publication manual. The change now is with respect to the 3rd level heading. The 3rd level heading now is going to be flush left, bold, italicized, title case heading, main words are capitalized, and the text is going to now appear below the level 3 heading. In the 6th edition, the level 3 heading was actually part of the paragraph, and only the first word was capitalized. So now it's different. It's going to, again, be flush left, in bold, main words capitalized, in italics. It's basically going to be just like the level 2 heading, except it's going to be in italics, if you want to look at it that way. So again, when you're writing your literature review, there may be cases where a 3rd level heading is going to be required, and if it is required, then just make sure that you're respecting the latest changes here as mentioned. Okay, Chapter 3, Journal Article Reporting Standards. So here they list the specifics of an abstract, and an abstract is going to depend on the type of paper that you're going to write. I didn't list all of the different types of abstracts that are available, but for the most part, students who are writing or doing research and thesis seminar are doing empirical research, and so the example that I've provided here is going to apply to most learners. You're going to begin by stating the problem that you're researching. You're going to include the participants or the data sources, include the essential features of the study that are included in your method section, and then you're going to present your basic findings and conclusions and implications. Try to do this all within one paragraph, between 150 to 250 words. It says in APA, in the manual, up to 250, but I think I would provide a range between 150 to 250. I think that's a reasonable word count. Again, one paragraph, making sure that there is no indentation in that paragraph. All other paragraphs listed in your academic text should have a 0.5-inch indentation. Again, the abstract does not require an indentation. Now, the introduction standards, I want to make a distinction between what they refer to as the introduction section versus the introduction paragraph. The introduction paragraph will include mostly the hook, followed by the context of the problem, and then we'll conclude with a thesis statement. The introduction section that they refer to really includes also the historical antecedents, the literature review, the theoretical framework that typically is involved in a paper that will precede the method section. All right, so the introduction section will also conclude with the research questions or the hypotheses, usually some sort of transitional paragraph that really links the theoretical problem that was explained in the literature review and link it and transition into setting up the method section that's going to come later. So the last thing I want to mention here about the introduction section is that you don't necessarily need, in fact, I would go ahead and say I would not include a heading called introduction. You're obviously going to have an introduction section, but you're going to begin your paper with the title of your paper, and it's going to be understood that the first text that begins your text is going to be your introduction paragraph that's going to begin your overall introduction section. So just a couple of notes there about what an introduction section is, but also what headings that you can include when writing your paper. So here I have a list here of some types of studies and what you might include. So you're going to begin with the title page. You're going to follow that with an abstract, and then you'll have your introduction section. So again, remember that this is not to say that you're going to have a heading called introduction. You're going to have a heading called that's going to include the title of your paper. But then after your introduction section that I mentioned before, then you'll have a section called method. And for a quantitative study, you'll have probably separate sections, one section for results, a second section for discussion. Now, qualitative study, essentially you're going to have the same sections with the exception of one section that's probably called findings/results, and another section called discussion. That's how it's listed here. I've also seen one section that's called results and discussion. So you can actually merge or bring in both your results and discussion within one section of your study. That's also another option. And then you've got your mixed methods. If you have some combination of a qualitative and quantitative type of study, those are going to reflect sections that are very similar to the qualitative study. Okay, Chapter 4, Writing Style and Grammar. So in the publication manual, they mention continuity and flow. I typically use words like coherence and cohesion. I also use the word unity to really refer to how we align supporting sentences that align with the topic sentence, how we align topic sentences to a thesis statement, how ideas are organized both in terms of an individual paragraph as well as how paragraphs are ordered throughout an essay or throughout the text, and how ideas flow from one idea to the next, how we connect ideas and link ideas from one sentence to the next as you progress throughout a paragraph. In English, it's always best to try to say more with less. If you can express the same idea with less words, most of the time that's going to be your best option. So try to always write concisely and making sure that you're writing with detail, but that you're trying to say as much as you can with as few of words as possible. Sentence length and paragraph length. Try to mix up the sentence types that you are using to develop a paragraph. So make sure that you try to include some combination of a simple sentence, compound sentence, a complex sentence, and a compound complex sentence. With regard to paragraphs, a typical rule I will suggest to students is to try to include around 5 to 8 sentences for any particular paragraph. Of course, there are exceptions, and this is not a rule based on APA. This is just my own personal suggestion. Always make sure you're checking with your instructor on what they would suggest, but you do want to make sure that when you develop a paragraph that you're creating sentences that are either following the meal plan, the main idea, evidence, analyze, and link, or using the P acronym, point, evidence, and explain sentences, that you're making a distinction between what type of sentence you're developing and how it relates to the rest of your paragraph. So it's very important. If you're finding yourself writing 1 or 2 sentence paragraphs, then you're probably not developing the paragraph as your instructor would expect. Okay, so do make sure that the paragraph length is enough and that you're using the types of sentences that develop body paragraphs for academic text. Make sure that when you're developing your ideas and your text that you're avoiding colloquialisms, slang, jargon, and anthropomorphisms. These are, or in other words, personification, giving human-like characteristics to objects. We want to try to avoid these types of constructions. Make sure that you realize that phrasal verbs are also idiomatic, so we want to try to also avoid of phrasal verbs when writing our academic text. Verb tenses, they list some suggestions. When you're developing your literature review and you're bringing in outside sources to cite, typically you'll reference those either in the past or present perfect tense. I've also seen the regular simple present as well. The method section can be either in the past tense or present perfect tense. And when you're reporting results, typically in the past tense. Discussion of implications of results are usually in the present tense, as well as the presentation of conclusions, limitations, future directions. Also use the present tense. This is a good guide to use, especially those in 8th semester developing the different sections of a research empirical study. These are some good notes to consider when you're thinking about what verb tense to use. For the most part, try to avoid the future tense. Be careful with subject-verb agreement, especially when it comes to using collective nouns and compound subjects joined by or nor. Make sure that when you're reviewing your own work, you're dividing up and checking each individual clause and making sure you're able to find the subject and the verb within each of those clauses so that you're checking specifically the correct subject-verb agreement for each of those clauses. Now, pronouns, a couple of things here. Overall, I would say try to not overuse pronouns. And in your topic sentences and your thesis statement, for the most part, I would also avoid personal pronouns altogether. Instead of using a personal pronoun, tell us what it is. You can use direct repetition, right? In terms of trying to avoid pronouns, in fact, you can try to use direct repetition. You can use synonyms. You can use hyponyms or hypernyms. These are some alternative ways to be more specific and making sure that you're being very clear in what you're referring to when you're connecting your ideas. Sometimes when we overuse pronouns, it can be a little bit confusing as to what the antecedent of that pronoun is. So whenever you're reviewing your own work and you're looking at your own personal use of a pronoun, ask yourself, could there be any confusion as to what the antecedent is of that pronoun? And if you think there's any risk, any doubt at all that a reader reading your text for the first time might be confused as to what the antecedent is of that pronoun, then again, use the alternatives that I presented here. Instead of a pronoun, direct repetition, synonyms, hyponyms, hypernyms. Those are some good alternatives for trying to avoid a pronoun. The active voice is preferred, so specifically try to avoid the non-referential it in the passive voice. For example, it has been found, it has been determined, it was seen. These are typical constructions that for the most part can be avoided. Try to present most of your ideas in the active voice. Make sure that you're respecting parallel construction, especially when you're creating lists and compound sentences, I should say. Now, strategies, there are many strategies for writing, and certainly your instructor is going to be presenting a lot of different options for you to employ when you're writing and researching and you're thinking about your research topic. And the point here is not to feel that you have to use all of these strategies, but that you explore and know enough about these different strategies so that you know which strategies work best for you. When you're reading, and I'm working with students at the beginning of the research process or at the beginning of the writing process, and we're trying to narrow down a topic, one of the best strategies that students can do is just keep reading the peer-reviewed journal articles that are going to be the best source of material for the most part for supporting your own ideas, is just to keep reading until you find what you need. And the students at our institution are fortunate to have a lot of databases available to them and a search engine that is good at really searching through all of those available databases and finding the different terms and articles that they need for their particular topic. And with a combination of using a Boolean search and being able to filter through the different results, learners here are going to have easy access to a lot, if not all the information they're going to need to develop most of the ideas. Seldom will students really need or feel required to find information outside of the databases, but the point here is, for the most part, students are going to be best served if they can find peer-reviewed journal articles, academic articles to support their ideas. This is going to be, I think, really the preference, even over books or book chapters or certainly websites. Really try to stick, for the most part, to academic articles to support your ideas, and I would try to limit those articles within the last 5 years for the most part. There can be exceptions. There are certainly seminal works and articles and studies that you might want to bring in, but make sure that they are key articles, key studies that are really relevant to your discussion. That's why I would recommend, for the most part, if you can stick with research that's done within the last 5 years, that's going to provide you with the most current data on your particular study. Now, another strategy, of course, reading or creating an outline, I should say. Also, maybe providing a mind map. If you're more of a visual person, you might have some visual representation of how your ideas are going to be organized for your essay. So make sure that whatever strategy you do use, that there is some planning involved. It's always best to have kind of an overview or a roadmap of where you're going with your writing. Of course, as you develop your writing and those ideas are changing as you continue to read and you continue to learn more about what you're presenting, it's common and it's perfectly acceptable to change and tweak your ideas as you go along. And so it doesn't matter necessarily that the outline you started with results to the outline that you end up with, but the point here is that you have some sort of plan, that you are organizing and thinking in advance how you want to present your ideas. And I think that will facilitate the writing process and certainly give you a better result at the end of the day. Make sure that you seek help from others, whether it's your classmates, other teachers, of course your instructor, your tutor that you're working with, maybe even someone outside of the school system, anyone really that's willing to help you and provide you feedback. Try to take advantage of that. This might also include formally more maybe some writing centers if you have access to copy editors. Just try to take advantage of any opportunities where others can provide you feedback, because you'll be better for that as well. Finally, develop a plan. Develop a system of writing and editing and receiving feedback that works for you, and try to get into this cycle of writing, producing something, editing, receiving feedback, reflecting on it, and then changing and making those edits as you go through the process. The more times that you can go through the cycle, the better. And sometimes it's frustrating if to receive feedback from others, but it's really to improve your writing. And you can never have enough time to edit your work. I mean, the writing process is an ongoing thing, and very seldom do you ever feel that you've really finalized your document and there are no changes that could be made. It's one of those things that you want to continue to work on and improve on as time allows. Okay, so these are different strategies. Certainly, this is not an extensive list of strategies. There are many more. But again, the key here is to find different strategies that work for you so that you can take advantage of these ways of working that produce the best results. Okay, Chapter 5, Bias-Free Language Guidelines. The main point here is to think about the topics that you're writing about, and if you are addressing any types of topics related to age, the disabled, gender identity, research participants, ethnic groups, sexual orientation, or social economic status, Make sure that you refer to the manual, the 7th edition, for the specifics on language that is most appropriate for these different groups of individuals. There are many changes that were made to this edition, and there's a lot of clarification on what language to be used. So definitely double check the different language topics and terms that are most appropriate. I'm not going to go into all of it at this point because it is quite extensive, but it's very important to make sure that you seek out that information when writing about these particular topics or these particular subjects. We want to try to avoid saying he or she or he/she, but we also now can use they, the singular they. This is now accepted when referring to individuals whose identified pronouns are not known, or when the gender or when the gender of a generic or hypothetical person is irrelevant. So the singular they now is acceptable, but again, we still want to avoid gender-specific language, writing out he or she, or quote he/she. Okay, we talked about bias-free language. Again, this is just a list here I've included in the SWAY presentation. And also concluding with a comment about intersectionality, a paradigm that addresses the multiple dimensions of identity and social systems as they intersect with one another and relate to inequality, such as racism, genderism, heterosexism, ageism, and classism, among other variables. So again, for further details on bias-free language, double-check this chapter. Chapter 6, Mechanics of Style. Now, the comma usage, there is an extensive list of different ways of using the comma, but I think the four or five, there's one I haven't listed here that I'll mention, but I think the four that are worth mentioning, the first being the serial comma. This is different than when writing in Spanish. Make sure that you include the serial comma before the connector and or the coordinating conjunction. If you're creating a list of terms, we will need to use the serial or Oxford comma. We want to use a comma after an introductory phrase. Typically, 5 or more words will justify using a comma to begin a sentence with, for example, a prepositional phrase or a participial phrase. We want to use a comma. We also want to use a comma for a non-restricted clause or a non-essential clause. We want to make sure we offset those types of clauses with a comma. And in a compound sentence, we want to make sure that we're developing or separating, I should say, two different independent clauses and using a comma before the coordinating conjunction. Now, I didn't list here in the SWAY, which I'll probably go back and add later, the appositive that often will modify a neighboring noun. We want to make sure that we offset appositives using a comma as well. Capitalization, the main thing here is try not to capitalize to emphasize a word. For example, sometimes students will use the term English language learner, and let's say that they want to later then abbreviate that term, ELL. The first time that they present the term, they'll write out English language learner and oftentimes capitalize language and the word learner, when really it's not necessary. You want to capitalize, of course, English because it's a proper noun, but you can write out language and learner in lowercase, and still you can abbreviate in parentheses afterwards. And of course, abbreviations are going to be capitalized, but in this case, it's not necessary to capitalize, in this example, language and learner. So capitalization, first word of the sentence, of course. We want to capitalize the first word after a colon in the case of a title. Proper nouns and trade names are capitalized, as well as job titles and positions. Titles of work are capitalized. Also, tests and measures, or the title of tests and measures, are capitalized. But again, try not to capitalize to emphasize words. Numbers, there are many examples and exceptions here, and I've tried to include some of those here in the SWAY. For the most part, the main point that I want to make here is numbers of 10 and above, you can use the number. Anything less than 10, for example, 1, instead of instead of writing the number 1, we want to write out 1, O-N-E. So write out numbers 0 through 9. Anything less than 10, we want to write out typically as a word. Numbers 10 and above, we can write out the number. Now, there are exceptions that I've listed here. I'm not going to go through all of those exceptions, but it's a general rule to think about whenever you're using numbers. Chapter 7 talks about tables and figures, and I'm not going to go into a lot of details. There are a lot of specifics in terms of the title, how to list the title, even the font sizes that are acceptable for including fonts or text within a table or figure. The main point here, I think I've already mentioned it before, when you're using any kind of visual in your text, make sure that you're labeling it either a table or a figure. And you're going to typically use numbers or letters. You can say figure 1 or table 1 or figure A, figure B. Make sure that you're following the order in which you present in your text. You're going to follow that type of order and then reference those tables within your text. So again, just check this chapter 7, for details on when you're using tables and figures. Now, chapter 8, works credited in the text. So again, the reason for knowing this information, there's a lot of information here about how to cite. We want to try to get these rules under our belt, so to speak. We want to learn about this so that we are avoiding not only plagiarism, but also self-plagiarism. Now, in the case of students, a lot of times if you write out text in one class, we want to make sure that we're referencing that. If you're using that or referencing it in another class, make sure that you're using proper APA style and standards to reference and connect those in your writing. Now, there are many different types of text here that are in-text citations that you can include. For example, classroom resources. Sometimes I'll see students that are referencing actual teachers in class that were not recorded. And although there are provisions for citing those, for the most part, my suggestion would be to avoid those types of resources. Again, our academic peer-reviewed journal, academic articles are going to be really our primary source for referencing and bringing out outside sources to support our own ideas. Personal communication might be used more often in 8th semester when you're doing research and you're conducting interviews, but personal communication can also extend to emails, text messages, online chats, direct messages, telephone conversations, live speeches, unrecorded classroom lectures, memos, letters, etc. So there are many different types of personal communication, and make sure that you take that in consideration when you're conducting your empirical study, and you're needing that information and you're reporting that into your own study. Personal communication is one of the few types of citations that do not require a reference. Now, here we have in-text citations. This is basically an author-date citation system for APA. You have a parenthetical and narrative citations. Those are the two types. My suggestion would be to use parenthetical for the most part over narrative. Focus more on the concepts than the authors. Typically, what they say is more important than who said it. So parenthetical citations probably should be used more often than narrative. And when you're direct quoting, make sure that you use that sparingly, no more than 15% of the text. In fact, I usually recommend to my learners to really paraphrase for the most part. Just paraphrase. That's really going to, for the most part, be the best way to do it. The only reason you would include a direct quote is if someone said something really interesting or maybe coined a phrase that is very relevant to your discussion, you might include a citation there. So there are times where a direct quote is useful. But for the most part, it's best to put in your own words someone else's ideas. And I think you'll find that it actually makes it easier to try to connect your ideas from one sentence to the next. When you're paraphrasing, you're actually adapting someone's idea and putting it in your own words within the context of a particular body paragraph. I feel that it's actually easier to connect those ideas when you paraphrase. A lot of times, if students are overusing direct quotes, there's oftentimes ideas that are just jumping from one idea to the next, and there's really no cohesion really to speak of when reading the text from one sentence to the next. Now, there are provisions for using or including unknown authors, and also there are times where maybe the years is omitted, and there are examples here in the sway for both of those. But I will say that for the most part, if you find a source that you don't know who said it and you don't know when they said it, it's going to be best if you can find another source that will provide that information. It's always best to have citations that you know who said it and when they said it. Okay, so for Chapter 9, reference list. A reference generally has 4 elements. It's going to include the author first, followed by the date, the title, and the source. And we have some examples here. Chapter 10 provides a really good extensive list of all the different types of references that are available. Of course, we're not going to go over all of those, but I did include some that I feel that are useful or that will be useful for our particular learners in our BA program. Now, the very first example here, the journal article with the DOI, the DOI now it's becoming more common, and the change in the 7th edition really relates to the URL. Before, the DOI, the number itself was included in the reference. Now the URL is included as shown here in this example. And this example here is correct except with regard to the indentation. And because I'm using a sway, it was difficult to actually bring in or incorporate indentations. But the indentation for a reference, the first line is flush left, and all subsequent lines within that same reference are going to include a 1/2 inch indentation. So here are some examples. Here's an example of a journal, magazine, or newspaper article without a DOI. Now, another change for with the 7th edition is that when you're using an academic research database like the ones that we have available at our institution, the database name nor the URL are now required. You do not include those in the reference. They're not needed. So that's an important note when using articles within our database. Now, this is when there is no DOI. If there is a DOI, then you just include the DOI, the URL that includes the DOI. Okay, so again, there's still no. It's not necessary to include the database, regardless if there's a DOI or not. If there's a DOI, then you're going to include that URL. We have a journal article now. This was another change in the 7th edition for those references that include more than 20 authors. This is an example of what that looks like. We're going to use now an ellipsis to those that have more than 20 authors. I think before the limit was 7, but now they increased that list, and we have to include all the authors up to 20. A journal article published in another language. Here's an example. It's always best to try to find sources that are in English, but if there are some cases where the information is very important and it's in another language, this is what the reference will look like. This is an example of a book. One of the main changes here in the book, and there's actually a mistake in this sway that I'm going to change. The location of the publisher now is not required. In fact, it's not used at all. You just have the author, the date, the title of the book, and then the publisher. That's essentially it. If you're looking at the sway, this example, Halliday, is a correct example. You've got the name, the date, the title of the book, and then the publisher. Book chapters without a DOI, this is what that would look like. Unpublished dissertation thesis, a dissertation or thesis from a database, and a dissertation or thesis published online but not in a database. So these are typical sources that learners will will come across that they might be using, that you might be using when you're writing your academic text. And again, the idea here is to provide just those examples that we see most often. Notice that I have not included any examples of websites or podcasts, only because probably those are not going to be the preferred types of references that you're going to be asked to include in your academic essay. Again, for the most part, your articles, specifically the peer-reviewed journal academic articles, are going to be your best go-to type of reference and citation that you want to include when you're writing your academic text. All right, so I think that is going to be it for now. Again, this just touches on some of the main aspects of the APA manual, the publication manual. I tried to make a distinction between some of the changes that were appropriate or incorporated in the 7th edition, as well as just overall aspects of APA that we've been talking about for years that haven't changed over the years, that continue. Wanted to bring this to your attention. This has been In the Classroom, an educational podcast making teaching and learning more transparent. Thanks for listening.